"And what does the saint do in the forest?" asked Zarathustra. The saint answered, "I make songs and sing them, and when I make songs, I laugh, weep, and mutter. Thus I praise God. With singing, weeping, laughing, and muttering, I praise the God who is my God. But what do you bring us as a gift?" When Zarathustra heard these words, he saluted the saint and said, "What should I have to give you? But let me go quickly, that I may take nothing from you." And thus they parted from one another, the old man and Zarathustra, laughing as two boys laugh. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spoke thus to his heart. Could it be possible? This old saint has not yet heard in his forest that God is dead? Hello and welcome to my presentation. What I am doing for my final project is looking at Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Strauss's tone poem of the same name. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German composer. He was born near Leipzig in the Prussian province of Saxony in 1844. He began studying theology and classical philology at the University of Bonn in 1864. He moved to the University of Leipzig in 1865 to continue his study of philology. He became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland in 1869. In 1879, he resigned from the University of Basel and began traveling due to sickness. He traveled between Switzerland, France, and Italy. In 1889, he suffered a mental breakdown. He died in 1900 from pneumonia. The work I'm looking at today is Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This was published in 4 volumes between 1883 and 1885. Your first question is probably, who was Zarathustra? Obviously, if he's speaking, he has to be someone. So Zarathustra was a prophet that lived sometime between 1500 and 1200 before Common Era. His original name was actually Zoroaster instead of Zarathustra. So Zoroaster was the founder of the oldest monotheistic religion, Zoroastrianism. This religion included the belief that a good god, the Ahura Mazda, or wise lord, and pretty much like a devil or an opposing evil god, Angra Mainyu, are in a constant cosmic battle, and as a human with free will, every act that you do either supports the good or the bad in this cosmic battle. The moral code developed by Zoroaster included telling the truth, being charitable and loving to other fellow humans, diet moderation, being honest in dealing with others, and always keeping one's promises. Zoroastrianism supports Ahura Mazda, or the wise lord, so that good triumphs over evil. The plot: Zarathustra descends from his seclusion in the mountains in order to tell the people below about his new discovery. He tries to tell a group of people in the first town he passes through about his teachings, but is laughed out of town. He finds some people who are willing to listen to him, teaching them to spread his knowledge to other people. His disciples do not understand what he is trying to teach them, so he decides to return to the mountains. Zarathustra has a vision that his former disciples are distorting his teaching, so he descends from the mountain a second time. Zarathustra fights with priests, poets, and scholars who have blended his teachings with the distorted teachings of Christianity. Zarathustra returns to the mountain, living there for many years before a group of superior humans arrive at his cave seeking knowledge. Zarathustra descends from his mountain once more to teach his new discoveries to the world. So this text is obviously a philosophical text, meaning that there are philosophical ideas incorporated into the literature. The ideas that are part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra are the idea of the Übermensch, the eternal recurrence, and the will to power. Man is a rope fastened between animal and Superman, a rope over an abyss. The Übermensch is the idea of a Superman involving the one who is willing to risk all for the sake of enhancement of humanity, in contrary to the last man, whose sole desire is his own comfort and is incapable of creating anything beyond oneself in any form. Must not all things that can run have already run along this lane? Must not all things that can happen have already happened, been done, run past? For all things that can run must also run once again forward along this long lane. The eternal recurrence is the idea that events have been and will keep repeating for all time. It's kind of like the idea of history repeating itself over and over and over indefinitely. What it accounts hard is called praiseworthy. What it accounts indispensable and hard it calls good. And that which relieves the greatest need, the rare, the hardest of all, it glorifies as holy. And the will to power is the idea that through the drive to succeed, anything can be overcome, which brings the individual to power over hardship. Richard Strauss was a late Romantic and early modernist composer. He was born in Munich, Kingdom of Bavaria in 1864. His father was Franz Strauss, who was the principal horn player of the Munich Court Orchestra. He had a traditional education, but dedicated his time to music on the side. In 1884, he was offered a position of assistant conductor at Meiningen. He became the conductor of the Munich Opera in 1886, then moved around as a conductor for a few years. In 1905, he composed Salome, which we covered in class. In 1909, he composed his other famous work, Elektra. He became the musical co-director of the Vienna State Opera in 1919. In 1929, he fell out of favor with the Nazi Party and moved to Vienna. He returned to Germany in 1849, where he died 3 months later. The composition. So Strauss's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or also Sprach Zarathustra, is his 30th opus. This work is a tone poem, which is a symphonic work that suggests a story-like or literary tone. This style of composition comes from the Romantic era. An example of a tone poem that you might know is Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet. It was composed in 1896 while Strauss was chief conductor of the Bavarian State Opera in Munich. The music includes 9 sections which depict scenes from Nietzsche's book. It premiered November 27th, 1896 in Frankfurt. Unfortunately, he did not conduct it himself. The tone poem became exceptionally famous for its use in Stanley Kubrick's 1968 movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Strauss wrote in a letter that he sent to a friend, "I did not intend to write philosophical music or portray Nietzsche's great work musically. I meant rather to convey in music an idea of the evolution of the human race from its origin through the various phases of development, religious as well as scientific, up to Nietzsche's idea of the superhuman. The whole symphonic poem is intended as my homage to the genius of Nietzsche." Interestingly enough, Nietzsche was actually still alive the year that it had premiered, but it was after his mental breakdown and he was not fully there mentally, so he did not have any comments on this piece. It's also been stated that Strauss's tone poem incorporates symphonic optimism in fin de siècle form, dedicated to the 20th century. So before we tie Strauss's musical work back to Nietzsche's original literary work, we have to decide whether it's actually possible to even portray philosophical ideas solely through music. According to Stephen Davies, a modern-day philosopher at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, music picks out and conveys something about emotions after the manner of linguistic utterances. That is, through combining elements according to rules with the function of generating and communicating a semantic or propositional content. So what this means is that the emotion in music comes from already learned and understood symbolic characteristics which the composer has carefully chosen to incorporate into his music. Certain musical gestures or phrases happen to be linked saliently with texts expressive of a given emotion and retain that connection over many years, so that purely instrumental music comes to be heard as expressive when it includes the relevant gesture or phrase. So what this quote means is that music that is somehow linked to text embodies the ideas within the text simply through the association. Nietzsche himself actually stated, "Has it been noticed that music liberates the spirit, gives wings to thought, that one becomes more of a philosopher the more one becomes a musician?" So did Strauss even want to portray Nietzsche's philosophy through his music? I have seen mixed ideas regarding this statement. I was looking through the websites of various orchestras, and I saw a mixture of both, yes, this was something that he was trying to do, and no, this was something that he was just trying to pay an homage to, but not recreate in musical form. So I pulled two quotes. One is from the NPR website, which states, "Through these sections, he wants to convey the essence of Nietzsche's philosophical approach to the world. Nietzsche wanted us as human beings to reconsider our value system and rather than blindly believe in a monotheistic God or in the advancing scientific field, start to hold ourselves accountable for our own actions." So the important part from this quote is the part that states he wants to convey the essence of Nietzsche's philosophical approach to the world. This implies that he had predetermined that he wanted to convey the philosophy in his music. To contrast this idea, I pulled a quote from Dudamel's website. If you don't know who Dudamel is, he is a conductor and he has great hair, so check him out. So what his website description of this song says is, the composer initially disavowed any connection between his score and Nietzsche beyond being inspired by the book's poetic imagery, and particularly its evocative chapter headings, 8 of which Strauss employed as non-specific guides in his score. The important part of this quote is, the composer initially disavowed any connection between his score and Nietzsche beyond being inspired by the book's poetic imagery. So by initially stating that the connection was simply that of inspiration, it would have been implied that he did not incorporate musical elements in an attempt to portray the philosophy because that was not his intention at the time of the composition. So finally, are philosophical ideas clearly portrayed in this composition? Well, I have two quotes. So the first one, by July 9th, 1895, Strauss was still only at the stage of thoughts about a new tone poem, which are listed in 6 categories. It is revealing of Strauss's approach to the work that these should be emotional states with no apparent reference to Nietzsche. So this quote explains that what he was initially doing when he began composing the tone poem was not to try and portray Nietzsche's philosophy, but rather to create a musical work that explores different moods. So the composition was started before he incorporated any of Nietzsche's stuff at all. The inevitable charge that was raised to the listener who was not forearmed with the detailed program was certainly not discover any connection with Nietzsche in the work. Zarathustra was thus twice damned for being program music and for not being explicitly programmatic. Had it been explicit, then the charge of being merely illustrative lay to hand. The program thus could be dismissed as an attempt to make the music seem more important than it was. It seems that, at least for the premiere, he was unable to portray Nietzsche's philosophy without a program explaining what was happening in the music. This quote alone refutes the idea that he was in fact able to portray the teachings of Zarathustra solely through music. I do have a question for you guys as well. So what do you think when you hear Strauss's Thus Spoke Zarathustra? Are you thinking about how the music sounds? Perhaps you're thinking about Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Or, alternatively, perhaps because now that we've discussed it, your mind has created an indexical connection between Nietzsche's literature and the music. Perhaps now when you hear the music, you're going to think about the Übermensch, the eternal recurrence, and the will to power. Through the association between music and literature, does the music portray Nietzsche's philosophy to you?